If you ask most people what a samurai sword is, they'll tell you that it's a katana or perhaps a tachi, with the shorter sword being the wakizashi. But what if I told you that there was one samurai who had a rapier? So let's look at the Minakuchi Rapier and find out whether it's actually everything it appears to be. Hi folks, Matt Easton here of Schola Gladiatoria in Easton Antique Arms. So before we jump into looking at the Minakuchi Rapier and indeed whether it is the rapier of a samurai essentially, we'll get into that in a second, we're first of all going to set a little bit of important context, very important on this channel as you know. So first of all, it's categorically known that in the 17th century particularly, perhaps in the latter part of the 16th century as well, Japanese arms and armour did make its way back to Europe. It's featured in various paintings and written about, and we even have some pieces surviving in collections from that time. So categorically, during that period of trade, primarily between the Japanese with the Dutch, the Spanish, the Portuguese, and to some degree the English as well, absolutely Japanese items found their way back to Europe. And of course, we famously know that European items made their way to Japan and were used so much so, of course, that firearms completely changed the face of Japanese warfare. Now, interestingly, the Japanese very often adopted European items, arms and armour, but made them into their own. So we often see, for example, Nanban style Japanese armours with European breastplates and helmets, very often bulletproof ones, so therefore highly prized, incorporated into Japanese style armours. And there is even an example of a Solingen-made, German-made sword blade, probably from a hanger or cutlass or dussac, that is being converted into something like a wakizashi, which is kept currently here in the UK in the Royal Armouries. So absolutely, we know that arms and equipment went in both directions. But when it's going to Europe, it's usually as a curio, as a sort of collectible, whereas when they went to Japan, they were usually converted into weapons. And of course, the Japanese, as well as converting things into their own style, very quickly copied them. And so very, very quickly, the Japanese started making their own muskets, inspired by the trade items that they brought in from Europe. Just to confuse matters even further, there's a style of metalwork known as sawasa, which is usually copper and gilded, but it's a style of manufacturing, usually hilt parts, that can be manufactured in Japan but then exported for the European trade. And in fact, we actually have not a small number of surviving small sword hilts that were made in Japan in the 17th and 18th centuries for the European market. In other words, a sword like this, a gentleman's dueling sword of the 18th century or late 17th century, with a Japanese-made hilt, grip and decoration. So the question is that what the Minakuchi Rapier is? Is it Japanese made for a European style weapon, but Japanese made? Or is it in fact a European rapier which was traded into Japan? So in short, what is the Minakuchi Rapier? Well, essentially it seems to be, or at least is widely described as, a Japanese made European style rapier of around 1600 in date, which is at the Fujisaka Shrine. It's maintained there, and supposedly belonged to Kato Yoshiaki, a very famous samurai general. Kato Yoshiaki lived from 1563 to 1631, and he was active really in the middle years of the Sengoku. That's the kind of warring period that so many sort of samurai stories are rooted in. And during this period, he initially aligned himself with the legendary Toyotomo Hideyoshi. He participated in the 1583 Battle of Shizugatake, and although 20,000 men fought for Hideyoshi at that battle, only 7 were given the title of 7 Spears of Shizugatake in recognition of their services in the battle. And Kato Yoshiaki was one of those. Kato was one of Hideyoshi's highest ranking generals, and after Hideyoshi's death, he aligned himself with the legendary Tokugawa Ieyasu, the third great unifier of Japan. And Kato again served, this time at the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600. And this was the battle that really ensured over 2.5 centuries of the Tokugawa rule or kind of supremacy over Japan. So Kato Yoshiaki wasn't just another guy, he was an incredibly important leader and general and ultimately kind of regional ruler of his time. Now the Minakuchi Rapier is actually funny because for years people assumed it was just a European trade item. But some years ago, I think it was probably about 6 or 8 years ago, there was a lot of sort of press details about this rapier because certain tests have been done and certain experts brought in that have concluded that it was actually Japanese made. But was it? And the Minakuchi Rapier is a swept hilt style of rapier, narrower blade than this. It's 104.5 centimeters long, which is around 41 inches, so it's a kind of average length for a European rapier of the time, and it has a series of bars in a style of hilt that we would call a swept hilt. Some sources on the internet say a basket hilt. We would call it a swept hilt. Now, interestingly, here are the main details for why it's supposed that this is definitely Japanese made. Part of it is artistic and part of it is scientific. So the first thing is they looked with scans at the blade and they argued that the structure of the blade shows Japanese style of manufacture. This, I think, is actually one of the weakest possible ways of suggesting that this is Japanese made. The reason being that the style of folding and layering the steel is not unique to Japan. You can find it all over Asia and in fact Africa and indeed Europe. So in fact the folded blade structure doesn't necessarily show Japanese manufacture. There's no ham-on, it's not edge quenched. The really sort of definitive or rather more characteristic Japanese, like clay tempering, Japanese blade manufacturing style isn't present on this rapier. They're only looking at the layered nature of the steel, which you can find in many places, including medieval and Renaissance Europe. So that's one argument they make that I think is somewhat weak. The second argument they make is that the pommel is threaded. Now, there are many sources, again on the internet, be careful what you read on the internet, that say that the threaded nature of the tang and the pommel mean that this is Japanese manufacture. Well, first of all, threads are not particularly common in Japanese manufacture, certainly not in sword manufacture. We do find threads on muskets. The Japanese copied thread making from the breech plugs on their muskets from European musket manufacture. And of course, you've got to note the irony there. Yes, indeed, they were threading things in Japan at this time, but they were only threading things because they were copying the European threaded things. So threaded manufacture is completely common in Europe, and in fact goes all the way back. We can find threads in loads of medieval art and manufacturing. 15th century poleaxes pretty much usually have threads involved in them. Some sword pommels are threaded. If we look at the Gladiatoria Codex, was the famous unscrewing the pommel and throwing it at your opponents. We literally have a screw-on pommel in a early 15th century source right there. So there are numerous examples going all the way back to the Roman period of threads in Europe. So the threaded tang by itself, and even we have rapiers with threaded tangs, and certainly small swords as well. Certainly the threaded tang by itself doesn't push us towards naturally concluding that this is Japanese manufacture rather than European. If anything, it would be an argument saying that it's European rather than Japanese. So at this point you might be thinking, hold on, Matt's arguing this is a European rapier, not actually Japanese, which numerous sources and even news sources have reported this is a Japanese rapier. In actual fact, no, I'm not arguing that. And actually the biggest, in my view, the biggest argument showing that this is Japanese manufactured, or at least the fittings are, and I'll come back to that in a second, is the swept hilt. So on the Minakuchi Rapier, the swept hilt is really weirdly proportioned, very strangely proportioned for a European rapier. It would look very out of place at somewhere like the Wallace Collection or the Stibbett Museum, because the proportions of all of the bars and rings are slightly kind of out compared to what we normally see with European versions, but also the number one, the materials used, but also the decorative style. And that doesn't only go for the guard. In fact, we do have a scabbard there as well with a chape on the end. And we have a grip. And if you look at the grip wire wrapping, if we look at the way that the bars are decorated, it does indeed have a Japanese style. So that opens up another possibility. Firstly, we could be looking at something that's European manufactured. We could be looking at something that's Japanese manufactured. Are we actually looking at something that's a composite? And I think this is something which hasn't been discussed, at least not anywhere I've seen, which is a distinct possibility. It's entirely possible that this was fundamentally a European rapier, which had elements of it either enhanced or replaced or added to in Japan by Japanese craftsmen. For example, they may have taken the original guard that was on it off and replaced it with a Japanese guard, emulating the original but getting the proportions slightly different and decorating it differently, and of course putting a Japanese made scabbard on it. But it could be that the blade and the fundamental core of the pommel and the threaded tang and all of that is actually European made. So the problem is the jury is out on this one, and we really don't know. What do I personally think? What's my personal theory? Well, first of all, I think we need to do more tests. We need more data, because there's been a lot of sweeping conclusions made about the rapier based on actually not very much kind of research, but also comparison with other European swords. I feel it's mostly been looked at from a Japanese sword perspective and not so much from a European sword perspective. However, I will state that based purely on what we can see, the proportions of the hilt are, in fact, the entire hilt, not just the guard, are rather odd. However, the blade isn't really odd. So it's entirely possible it's a European blade that came with a threaded tang that they made a pommel to screw onto, and they entirely made the guard. And if I had to lay my money on any one of the possible theories, I think that it's probably a part European, part Japanese product. I don't necessarily think that the whole thing was made in Japan. So what do you think? Get posting down below. The sword of Kato Yoshiaki, do you think it is actually his sword? Do you think it was purely a dress sword? Do you think it was something he maybe carried in warfare? I think either could be true, actually. I certainly don't think, as some people have said, that just having a screw thread pommel makes it unfit for service, because we know there were plenty of swords, including most Victorian swords, that have threaded tangs at the end, and they were used extensively in warfare all over the world. Yeah, do you think it was just a dress item, a status item? It could have just been a collector's item, frankly. Or do you think it was potentially something that was actually possibly used or carried in war, at least? And do you think that it was all Japanese made or European made, or a mixture of both, which I think probably on balance might be the most likely outcome, even if it doesn't fit the narratives that news sources like. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton, and I will of course continue to be, and I'll see you back on the channel soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.